Episode 24: Engines, Empires, and the Industrial Order, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back to the Once and Future Present. I'm Casey Brooks, your host. Today we're diving into the steam and smoke of the Industrial Revolution. It's one of those big, world-changing moments that textbooks make sound inevitable. But was it really? Dr. Morgan is here to help us understand how it all got rolling. Hey, Dr. Morgan!
Hi, Casey. The Industrial Revolution really is one of the most transformative eras in world history. It began in Britain around 1780 and gradually spread across Europe and beyond, radically altering economies, governments, and global power structures. But it wasn't just a story of machines and factories. It was about people, too.
And Professor Theo is here with us, as always, to help make sense of those human experiences. Hey, Professor Theo.
Hi, Casey. While Dr. Morgan will guide us through the economic and political engines of change, I'll focus on how it shaped people's lives, especially for workers, families, and communities. This era sparked intense debates about labor, gender, class, and the meaning of progress itself.
Let's get started. Dr. Morgan, how did this all begin? Why Britain?
Britain had a unique combination of factors that made it the ideal launching point for industrialization. First, its rich deposits of coal and iron were located conveniently close to each other and near navigable rivers, which made transporting raw materials much easier and cheaper. Coal became the key fuel source for steam engines, and iron was essential for building those engines, machines, tools, and eventually railways. Second, wages in Britain were relatively high compared to other parts of Europe. This created a strong incentive to find ways to reduce labor costs, leading inventors and entrepreneurs to experiment with labor-saving machines. It wasn't just about having resources, it was about the economic motivation to innovate. Third, Britain had a robust banking and financial system. Private banks, the Bank of England, and the stock market made it easier to raise capital for new factories, technologies, and infrastructure projects. The government, through stable laws and protection of property rights, provided a relatively secure environment for investment and entrepreneurship. Fourth, Britain had a growing overseas empire that brought in a steady stream of raw materials, especially cotton from the American South, and created captive markets for British manufactured goods. The British Navy protected trade routes and shipping interests, further securing Britain's global commercial dominance. Finally, the agricultural revolution of the 18th century had already transformed rural life. Innovations like crop rotation, selective breeding, and the enclosure movement boosted food production, leading to a population boom. At the same time, many small farmers were displaced and moved to cities in search of work, providing the labor force needed for new urban industries.
So it wasn't just about new technology popping up out of nowhere?
Not at all. Many of the key technologies, like the spinning jenny and the water frame, were designed to solve very specific economic problems, mainly how to increase textile production with fewer labor costs. Later, steam engines revolutionized not only textiles, but transportation and mining as well. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine made it much more efficient, allowing it to power everything from looms to locomotives. And with the rise of railroads, we saw a true transportation revolution. Tracks linked cities and ports, reduced the cost of shipping goods, and increased the speed of commerce. Railroads also became some of the largest businesses in the world and set new standards for investment, engineering, and timekeeping. Standardized time zones were developed in part to coordinate train schedules.
What exactly is a spinning jenny?
It's a hand-powered spinning machine invented by James Hargreaves in 1765. It allowed one worker to spin multiple spools of thread at the same time, vastly increasing efficiency in textile production.
And that had huge social consequences. The spinning jenny dramatically altered the textile industry by multiplying a single worker's productivity. Before its invention, spinning was done slowly by hand in homes, often by women and girls who were part of cottage industries. With the spinning jenny, what once took several people a long time could now be done by one worker much faster. This not only displaced skilled artisans, but also shifted control of production from homes to factory owners. It marked a turning point in labor organization, a move towards centralized factories where time, discipline, and output were controlled by employers. Entire families had to adapt to a new rhythm of life, urban, fast-paced, and highly disciplined. And because the machine was relatively simple, it didn't require highly trained labor, which made it easier for factory owners to hire unskilled workers, including children.
What about outside Britain? Did other countries copy this model right away?
They tried, but with mixed success. Continental Europe began industrializing after 1815. Countries like Belgium, France, and parts of Germany had to overcome some serious disadvantages. They lacked Britain's infrastructure, had less access to coal, and faced competition from cheap British imports. But with help from governments and investment banks, they caught up by mid-century. In France, the government supported infrastructure like roads and railways to encourage growth. In the German states, the Zollverein, a customs union, helped unify markets and reduce internal trade barriers, encouraging industrial development. Railroads played a huge role in that process. They reduced transportation costs, connected cities, and fueled demand for coal, iron, and engineering. Governments often encouraged their construction directly through subsidies, land grants, or by guaranteeing loans to private investors. In France, for instance, the state worked with banks to finance large-scale railway networks. In Prussia, government ministries coordinated rail construction as part of a national development strategy. Railroads weren't just economic tools, they were seen as symbols of national progress and unity.
So was Britain trying to keep its technology a secret?
Yes, for a while, it was illegal for British artisans to emigrate or export machinery. But entrepreneurs like William Cockerill smuggled out designs and know-how. He set up a major industrial complex in Belgium that helped kickstart continental industry.
And that spread more than just technology. It brought new social structures, a growing industrial middle class, and an emerging working class that began to define itself in opposition to factory owners. But industrialization didn't reach all parts of Europe equally. In Eastern Europe and Russia, for example, most labor was still tied to agriculture and serfdom well into the 19th century. This uneven development would widen regional disparities in wealth and power.
That sounds like class conflict. Is that when we get terms like class consciousness?
Exactly. Class consciousness is the awareness that you belong to a particular economic group whose interests might conflict with others. As workers came to see themselves as a distinct class, they began organizing for better conditions and political rights. Mutual aid societies and friendly societies became ways to support each other outside of the factory system. Inside the factories, workers often resisted in quieter ways, arriving late, slowing down production, or finding ways to avoid fines for breaking rules. Employers tried to impose discipline through bells, shift systems, and overseers, but it was never a smooth process.
Were their conditions really that bad?
Yes, especially in the early decades. Conditions inside the early factories were extremely harsh. The air was thick with lint and dust, ventilation was poor, and machines were dangerous and often unguarded. Workers faced long hours, sometimes up to 14 or 16 hours a day, with very few breaks. Factory owners imposed strict rules, including fines for being late, talking, or making mistakes. Children were particularly vulnerable to injury, exhaustion, and abuse. Beyond the factory walls, urban slums were overcrowded and unsanitary. Tenement housing often lacked proper ventilation, sewage, or clean water. In some cities, average life expectancy dropped dramatically. In Manchester, it fell to as low as 25 years. These conditions eventually led to calls for reform. Edwin Chadwick, a social reformer, investigated public health and advocated for modern sanitation systems. His work helped launch Britain's first Public Health Act in 1848.
Eventually, governments began to respond. In Britain, the Factory Acts of the early 1800s limited child labor and mandated basic safety standards. The 1833 Factory Act, for example, prohibited the employment of children under 9 and limited work hours for older children. Later, the 10 Hours Act of 1847 capped the workday for women and children at 10 hours. Enforcement, however, was often weak. Alongside these reforms, the poor laws were redesigned to reflect new beliefs about poverty. Many believed the poor were responsible for their condition, leading to harsh workhouse systems.
Wait, why were women and kids working in mines?
Because they were cheap labor. Industrialists often hired women and children to keep wages low and maximize profits. It wasn't until social reformers pushed back, sometimes with help from middle-class allies, that legal protections began to emerge. The Mines Act of 1842, for instance, banned underground work for all women and for boys under 10. But even after reforms, working-class families often depended on every member, including children, to contribute to household income. That created tension between protective laws and economic reality. Before the Factory Acts, it was common for entire families to work together in the same factory. Parents and children might be employed on the same floor, with older siblings helping to look after younger ones, while everyone contributed to household income. This wasn't ideal, of course, but it allowed working-class families to function as economic units. When the Factory Acts began limiting child labor and restricting the hours women could work, the intention was to protect vulnerable workers. But it created new challenges. If children could no longer work and women were restricted in hours, families lost key sources of income. And because women were typically paid less than men, many families decided the mother would stay home to watch the children, even if she had previously worked in the factory. That left them more dependent on a single male wage earner, which made them more economically vulnerable and reinforced gender divisions.
That's so intense. And what about responses from workers themselves?
One famous example is the Luddites, a group of skilled textile workers who smashed machines in protest of being replaced. The movement began around 1811 in Nottinghamshire and quickly spread to other regions. These workers were not simply anti-technology. They were reacting to how machines were being used to undercut skilled labor and depress wages. The Luddites often destroyed frames, mechanical knitting devices, that allowed employers to hire cheap, untrained labor instead of experienced artisans. Their name came from a possibly mythical figure named Ned Ludd, who was said to have smashed a weaving machine in a fit of rage. The British government treated the Luddites as a serious threat. In 1812, Parliament passed the Frame Breaking Act, which made machine breaking a capital offence, punishable by death. Troops were dispatched to guard factories, and dozens of Luddites were arrested and tried, with many facing harsh penalties including execution. The harsh response shows how authorities prioritized property and industrial development over the concerns of laborers. The idea was to make an example of them and to deter others from organizing. Before that, workers faced significant legal obstacles to organizing. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made it illegal for workers to form unions or even gather to demand better wages or conditions. These laws treated collective bargaining as a criminal conspiracy. Even peaceful efforts to organize could result in arrest, and the laws sent a chilling message to laborers trying to defend their rights.
What kind of punishment did workers face if they were arrested for breaking those laws?
Great question. Workers caught violating the Combination Acts could face steep fines, imprisonment, or even transportation. That meant being forcibly sent to penal colonies, most often Australia, for years or even for life. It was a harsh and deeply isolating punishment meant to serve as a warning to others. Transportation separated people from their families and communities and showed just how serious the government was about cracking down on labor organization. In addition to protesting and facing legal risks, Many working-class men and women also joined reform movements like Chartism, which demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual elections.
What exactly was in the People's Charter, and why was it such a big deal?
Great question. The People's Charter, drafted in 1838, laid out 6 key demands: universal male suffrage, a secret ballot, no property qualifications for members of parliament, payment for MPs so working class men could afford to serve, equal electoral districts, and annual parliamentary elections. While none of these demands were accepted when they were first proposed, the Charter became a powerful expression of working class political identity and frustration. Each demand would have dramatically reshaped how the British government functioned. Universal male suffrage and equal electoral districts would have expanded political power beyond the wealthy elite. The secret ballot and annual elections would have increased accountability and reduced corruption. Eliminating property qualifications and paying MPs would have opened Parliament to ordinary men, not just landowners and the wealthy, making government more representative of the broader population. Over time, most of its goals were gradually adopted, showing how radical ideas can become mainstream through persistent public pressure. Their People's Charter became a symbol of working-class political activism. Chartist petitions gathered millions of signatures, even if Parliament rejected them. Though Chartism failed to achieve its goals at the time, it laid the groundwork for future democratic movements. The Combination Acts were repealed in 1824. After that, unions became more widespread and started advocating not just for wages, but for broader political reforms.
Can I ask, what exactly is a union? Why didn't factory owners want people to form them? And why did workers think they were important?
Good question, Casey. A union is an organized group of workers who come together to negotiate collectively with employers. They push for better wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. Factory owners opposed unions because they threatened profits and challenged their authority over the workplace. From the workers' perspective, a union gave them a voice and strength in numbers, something individual workers usually lacked. Unions were one of the few ways laborers could push back against long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions.
But this wasn't just about wages and hours, right? Did all this economic change affect culture too?
Yes, the idea of separate spheres emerged during this time. The belief that men should work in the public world of business, while women should stay in the private world of home and family. Sarah Stickney Ellis and other writers promoted this ideal for middle-class women. And this belief shaped how middle-class people viewed the working class. Many middle-class observers, especially women, assumed that working-class women who labored outside the home, especially in factories or in cities, were morally suspect or even sex workers. This unfair assumption contributed to the stigma and social isolation many working-class women faced, even as they were doing the hard labor that kept industrial society running.
That sounds super limiting.
It was, and it was also contested. Many working-class women continued to labor in factories or as domestic servants, while middle-class women were encouraged to become the moral guardians of the home. This period saw intense debates over women's proper role in society, which would eventually lead to early feminist movements. It also influenced marriage patterns. Urbanization and wage labor led many to marry later, and more young people made choices independently rather than relying on family matchmaking.
So this was a time of invention, but also inequality.
Very much so. Even though new technologies improved productivity, they also deepened divides between owners and laborers. The economic theories of people like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo reflected this. Malthus warned that population growth would outpace food supply, leading to famine and poverty. Ricardo's iron law of wages argued that wages would always sink to the minimum necessary to keep workers alive. He believed that if workers were paid more, they would have more children, which would eventually lead to a larger labor supply. That increase in available workers would drive wages back down again. In his view, any attempt to improve workers' living standards would be self-defeating unless population growth was controlled. This theory justified keeping wages low and opposed social reform, reinforcing the belief that poverty was an unavoidable part of the industrial economy.
But others pushed back. Friedrich Engels, who would later collaborate with Karl Marx, wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. He condemned industrial capitalism for creating new forms of suffering. Engels based his account on first-hand observation while living in Manchester, one of the epicenters of British industrialism. He detailed the overcrowded housing, rampant disease, unsafe factories, and brutal work routines faced by the urban poor. Engels argued that these conditions were not accidental but systemic, produced by the capitalist drive for profit at the expense of human life. His work became one of the foundational texts for modern socialism and a scathing indictment of the social costs of industrial progress. Other reformers like Robert Owen, a utopian socialist, tried to reform society through cooperative communities like New Lanark.
Wait, Robert Owen? I think I saw that name on a sign in Indiana. Is that the same person?
It is. Robert Owen helped found a short-lived utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana, in the 1820s. He believed that a cooperative, rationally planned society could eliminate poverty and social injustice. Though his American experiment didn't last long, it became a symbol of the transatlantic reform movement and reflected his broader commitment to rethinking society from the ground up.
Wait, was this the beginning of socialism?
Yes, in a sense. The conditions of the Industrial Revolution inspired calls for alternatives to capitalism. Early socialists emphasized cooperation over competition. Later thinkers, including Marx and Engels, argued for revolutionary change through class struggle.
Did slavery have anything to do with all this?
It did. While industrial labor in Europe was largely free, much of the raw material, especially cotton, was produced by enslaved people in the Americas. Profits from the Atlantic slave trade and plantation economies helped finance industrial growth in Britain and Europe. Even after Britain abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833, it continued importing slave-produced goods.
So even though Britain banned the slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery in its colonies by 1833, it still relied on slave-produced goods?
Exactly. The global economy of industrialization was deeply tied to systems of unfree labor, even as European societies praised themselves for progress and moral improvement.
That is such a contradiction.
History is full of them. The Industrial Revolution brought astonishing innovation and laid the groundwork for modern life. But it also intensified exploitation, disrupted communities, and created enduring inequalities. And while Western Europe industrialized, regions like Eastern Europe and Russia lagged behind, still relying heavily on serf labor and agrarian economies. That divergence would shape European geopolitics for the next century.
And industrialization also fueled imperialism. As European nations grew wealthier and more technologically advanced, they sought new markets and resources abroad, laying the groundwork for a global imperial order.
So the next time I see a train or a factory, I'll remember that it wasn't just steam that powered the Industrial Revolution. It was also coal, cotton, and countless hours of human labor.
Well said, Casey.
Indeed. And we'll keep exploring those complexities in future episodes.
Speaking of which, next time we're shifting gears to dig into the question of how much did slavery contribute to the Industrial Revolution. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. Don't forget to check out our AP Euro music projects from Hammer History Productions. And as always, stay curious, think critically,